Now I get to be the stick in the mud and talk about what the scholars mean when they say unmerited. And it's not, language matters, and how we define our words matters. And if you don't think that's true, go out in public and say anything in this current climate that we're in. It matters. And so what we say and how we define the words that we're using matter. And when we say stupid things like, oh, Jesus came to end all religion, well, that's dumb. But what we mean is Jesus came to put to death the idea that we can access God through practice. That doesn't mean that we don't practice things. Everybody practices something. I'm not religious. Yes, you are. That's why I'm wearing this shirt today. I'm not religious. I'm spiritual. Congratulations, you're religious. You don't get to divorce the two, okay? It's just not how it works. I'm an atheist. Congratulations, you're religious. It's okay. It's just something we do. And Jesus didn't come to end all forms of practice whatsoever that we do in our lives to help, but he did come and help us be free of a specific way of doing religion, of trying to access God through one specific way of doing all that. And so that way of defining religion works. And when the scholarly lexicons say unmerited favor, they don't mean undeserving, wormy person idea. Okay, what they mean is there's nothing you did to earn it on your own merit. Okay, you didn't pay for it. There is no economy of exchange with God. God does not need payment. The moment there is a payment, it is no longer grace, and therefore it is unmerited. Okay, so when a scholar says that versus when some pastor gets up on the stage and calls grace unmerited favor, miles apart. How Joseph Prince and the grace movement mean it, they're incorrect. And what Dad and Nathan did today was to correct them. But how you hear it from a scholarly lexicon, if you look into those, doesn't mean it that way. It means it from the economy of exchange idea. That idea doesn't enter into the thought of the biblical writers. God is not a vending machine that we pay and get what we want. Okay? God doesn't dispense justice when we've put in the right amount of prayer, or when we've, ousted this world leader or that world leader. Oh, now God can dispense justice. No, well, that God is a vending machine, and he's fairly worthless. Okay, and so that idea, but the other idea, yeah, run with it. Anyways, I've been sanding all week, and so I sanded my thumbprint off, and so I keep having to actually enter my passcode on my phone. So if it locks down on me, I'll let you know. I thought it was fitting that we sang a song where the chorus said, "Let your fire fall and purify our hearts." And this week we are in Genesis 18 and 19 and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not always that the music is topical to the preaching, but today it kind of is. So what we're going to do, we've got a lot to cover because we're doing Genesis 18 and 19. But what we are not going to do is cover the whole dialogue between Abraham and God where he says, he keeps whittling it down. Oh, what if 45 are found? Well, what if 40 are found? Just know that Abraham goes by fives. And he counts his way down, and they stop at 10 for a reason, because Lot's family doesn't have 10 people, but it does have 5. And so if he says, save 5, and God says yes, then God has to save the whole town. Okay, so when we get there, that's why they stop at 10, theoretically. Or it could just be that the author was like, okay, that's enough. I made my point. There's nobody there that's righteous. Because the Bible actually doesn't say, as we shall see, that Lot was righteous. So 18:1, and Yahweh appeared to him. Now, this is tied back to 17 because it says to him, correct? Who is him? Abraham. You don't know that unless you've read chapter 17. So when we're talking about breaking all this stuff up literarily, 17 and 18 kind of go together. And then 19 is a part of that, and we're going to cut off part of 19 because it's a different story. So it shouldn't be too hard for us. Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:4 is the first creation story. Our chapters and verses are silly. And we really kind of need to dump them and read Bibles without them. Because then you read it like a story, like it's intended. Okay, so Yahweh appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, and he was sitting in the doorway of the tent at the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, 3 men were standing near him. Now it just said that Yahweh appeared to him. But wait, there's 3. Trinitarians are rejoicing internally. Because it's Yahweh, but he appeared as 3. What do we do with that? Nothing. Jews don't do anything with it. They leave it alone. Yahweh appeared and he had 2 people with him. That's fine. 3 men were standing near him, and he saw them and ran from the doorway of the tent to meet them, and he bowed down on the ground. And he said, "My Lord." Now there's a question here because some ancient interpreters translated this as plural and said, "My lords." And it's Abraham giving a divine honorific to 3 people. Okay? But in the version that we have, it's singular, so it says, "My Lord." So he's speaking to the one who appears to be the leader of the group. "My Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest under the tree. And let me bring you a piece of bread, then refresh yourselves. Afterward, you can pass on once you have passed by with your servant." Then they said, "Do so as you have said." So there's this like mess of singular and plural back and forth, and he's talking to him, and then they reply. And so just kind of watch that. And in the Hebrew, you see it a lot more clearly, and the English translations kind of mess it up a little bit. Okay, this is a very kind of obscure thing in the Hebrew text because it's more than one thing talking back to Abraham at times, and then it's one of them talking, and then he talks to all of them, and then he talks to one of them. And so it's kind of there's a lot of divine stuff going on with these 3 characters, okay? And I don't think we need to go any further than that. I think we can just say there's something else here. Then Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah, and he said, "Quickly make 3 seahs of fine flour for kneading and make bread cakes." And Abraham ran to the cattle and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, and he made haste to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf which he prepared and set it before them. So some time's gone by, right? Like that doesn't happen in a matter of a verse. That happens over a few hours. And he was standing by them under the tree while they ate. Now, this, people have played this. Be what would be considered to be normal hospitality for the ancient Near East. This is what you could expect if you were a traveler and you happened upon like a family that had their cattle grazing, and you said, "Hey, I need a place for lodging." They would say, "Okay," and this is how they would treat you. Okay? And so this whole idea about the hospitality of Abraham is very, very important for what's coming. Okay? In other words, Abraham isn't a bastion of sexual morality. Okay? So keep that in your mind. And they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Now, that would freak me out. Some guys I've never known, like, "Hey, where's your wife, Sarah?" Huh? And he said, "She's here in the tent on Facebook." And he said, "I will certainly return in the spring, and look, Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now, this isn't the angel or the Lord actually saying, "Hey, I'm going to be back at this." Come back. Him. And Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. The way of women had ceased to be for Sarah. She had gone through menopause. Okay? That's probably why she mistreated Hagar. She was going through menopause when that happened. Shoes are flying up front. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, and I don't know if you've ever heard this, but the word for laughter is Yitzhak, so it's Isaac. So Sarah laughed to herself. This would be like us saying, "Well, I laughed when God told me the name of my kid." And, "Well, what's the name of your kid?" And, "Well, it's Giggle." And so that's kind of what's going on here. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my husband is old, shall this pleasure be to me? Then Yahweh said to Abraham, what is this that Sarah laughed, saying, is it indeed true that I will bear a child now that I have grown old? I mean, it's not necessarily what she said. So, there's some things here, right? So then, is anything too difficult for Yahweh? At the appointed time, I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah shall have a son. And you'll notice that doesn't happen. But anyways, but Sarah denied it, saying, I didn't laugh. Okay, so remember, the Bible actually doesn't cover up the mistakes of its heroes. Okay, this is where the Bible tends to be kind of unique among religious literature, is that their heroes, they screw up and the Bible says so. In the Hebrew, this says, but Sarah lied. It doesn't say that she denied it or anything like that. It says, but Sarah lied, saying. And so this is a matriarch. This is someone who is literally the mother of Israel. And they called her a liar. And he said, no, but you did laugh. Then the men set out from there. And so that's the end of the discussion. He's like, no, you did. And then he just walks away. There's no more argument. There's no more, and here's what's going to happen. There's no more I told you what was going to happen, and you laughed at me, and now you're going to have to name your kid Giggle because of it. Okay? And so see you later. Have fun with that. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down upon Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on their way. Then Yahweh said, shall I conceal from Abraham what I'm going to do? So obviously there's a Yahweh talking to someone there, and he's talking to these other men that are with him, the other two in the three. And so it's, there's a lot of question here, and there's a lot of ancient interpretation done on this, and some of it involves Christianity. And so, there's a lot of ways to go from here, so we're just going to keep reading. Because you can get stuck here for a long, long, long time. Abraham will surely become a great and strong nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed on account of him. Does it say that the nations that bless Israel will be blessed on account of him? Does it say that the ones that pray for the peace of Jerusalem will be blessed on account of him? Oh, it says all nations, which would have to, by nature of the word all, include Palestine. Or south of our border. For I have chosen him, that he will command his children and his household after him, that they will keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring upon Abraham that which he said to him. Then Yahweh said, now I want you to listen very closely to this, because this is going to get into where we're going to go. Because the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very serious, I will go down and I will see. Have they done altogether according to its cry of distress which has come to me? If not, I will know. Okay, so right there, this is God himself in the text giving the reason why Sodom is being investigated, is being put under the razor, as they would call it. Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. That is very, very unclear. But it is one thing that is very clear is that it doesn't say because men are engaged with consensual sex with one another. It doesn't. It doesn't say because there are gay people in the city. So as we read this, you're going to realize that anybody who puts that into this story is not only wrong, they're doing it because they have a bias. And it's it's not even in the story anywhere. You won't find it. Trust me. I'm about to prove it to you, but you can trust me ahead of time too. Stupid thumbprint. Okay. So I'm going to read from Nahum Sarna. We've been reading some of his commentary on Genesis. He is or was a rabbi and wrote for the Jewish Publication Society. Very, very good in the historical critical stuff on the Bible. He says the Hebrew root za'ak indicates the anguished cry of the oppressed. This is the outcry that's come up against Sodom. And it's so great that God himself has come down to investigate it. It indicates the anguished cry of the oppressed, the agonized plea of the victim for help in some great injustice. There is a soul-stirring passion that pervades the Hebrew word. Then he lists some biblical instances of this word, the za'ak of Israel while they're enslaved in Egypt. Okay, the outcry of Israel against their Egyptian taskmasters. You got blocks? And their cry is so great that God has to come down and get involved. Okay? There is, I can't remember, I think it's Exodus, that God heeds the za'ak of the widow and the orphan when they are oppressed, and God himself will go down and get involved. Okay, that's the idea in Exodus. In Isaiah, he says that za'ak, this outcry, is the opposite of righteousness. And he says, I looked for righteousness, and instead I found za'ak. I found an outcry, So then Sarna sums up by, the outcry of Sodom then implies, above all, heinous moral and social corruption, an arrogant disregard of elementary human rights, a cynical insensitivity to the sufferings of others, or in our modern day terms, politicalization of children in cages. So I don't care, don't get political. Neat, I didn't, the Bible did. You don't justify it. You understand that from a biblical perspective, when an outcry begins to arise because they are being mistreated, God himself gets involved. That's not comfortable, is it? And, whether we like it or not, I love where I live, but America is an empire in every sense of the word as it has historically been defined. An empire in the Bible is always represented by Egypt, Babylon, in Rome, in Assyria, and these nations that oppress. Okay, it's not just that they are victorious nations, it's that they are actually oppressive. Okay, and so this is kind of like the first primeval example of the Bible dealing with empire. And how does the Bible deal with empire? At least in this occasion. Empire gets wiped out by the hand of God because the outcry of the victim is so great against it. Okay, and if we want to contextualize some of the way that the ancient Near East behaved, you can go look at what Assyria did to Israel and what Babylon did to Israel, and look at Israel's response in the Psalms. Happy is the one who did what you did to us and dashes your infants against the rocks. That's the barbarism of what's going on and the kind of oppression and stuff that this outcry is produced by. Okay, so this isn't just, I need greater freedom to move about the freest country on earth. This is about actual literal oppression, okay? And doing things to people that by rights you were supposed to be hospitable to. Okay, so it's framed Abraham as this bastion of hospitality, not of sexual morality. Because we already know from earlier that Abraham's lied about his wife and called her his sister. So it's he's not even really a bastion of morality in that way, right? He's a pinnacle of hospitality. And that leads us right into Sodom and Gomorrah and why they're being destroyed. Let me get back to the story. So then Abraham does this thing, and he's like, hey, are you going to kill all the righteous people too just because of the few wicked people? And God's like, I'll tell you what, let's make a deal. And they start doing their let's make a deal briefcases. He's like, I'll take the one that's in 1,000. God's like, nope, not even 1,000 there. And he goes like, okay, well, how about 50? And he's like, nope, there's not 50 there. Oh, how about 40? Nope, there's not 40 there. So they whittle it all the way down, and God's like, fine, I'll tell you what, if you can find 10 righteous people, I'll save the whole city. There you go. And Abraham kind of hangs his head because he knows there's not 10 righteous people there. So we're going to skip all the way down then. Yeah, verse 30, 2 and 33 are the end of chapter 18, and that's kind of the end of the discourse between God and Abraham. Hey, I'll save it if you find 10. Okay. And the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and so now there's not 3 anymore, there are 2, so Yahweh must have departed. Okay. And Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. Then Lot saw them and stood up to meet them, and he bowed down with his face to the ground. Sound familiar? Okay, so he's doing right. He's doing what should be done according to their customs. And he said, "Behold, my lords," plural there, not singular, like Abraham, who was bowing at Yahweh's feet and said, "My Lord, please turn aside into the house of your servant and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, but we will spend the night in the square." And that's like, if you're watching a movie, the ominous music would come on there. You know, because everybody knows that the square, you don't go in the square after dark. But he urged them strongly. Duh. And they turned aside with him and came into his house. That's kind of like he insisted. It's not urged strongly. It's like, I'm not going to let you do that. You don't know where you are. This was voted the least likely city in the ancient Near East to succeed. It's a bad area. And he made a meal for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. And again, this is weird. Do angels eat? They do? Not in the biblical perspective, they don't. In fact, from a Jewish perspective, it's heresy for God to have physical attributes, because God is ineffable and invisible. And so if God eats, that's a problem. Okay, so this kind of language, that's nothing but for your own pleasure as you're reading through this kind of stuff. When you see little things like that, there's probably a mountain of work that has been done on and they ate. Before they laid, and sorry, incidentally, this is also why it's kind of hard for someone who's still to this day born in a predominantly Muslim country to accept Jesus being the Son of God, because God doesn't have sex. God is not that kind of being. And so when we present it that way, it doesn't get through. But guess what does get through? Messenger. We saw a messenger, and then the messenger leaves and they're like, "We saw the Lord." Oh, that works. That's why they wrote the Gospels. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. They're being very, very clear about the total depravity in this city, right? Everyone, even the little kids came out. Okay, so then that needs to put in our mind, are we really thinking that the only interest in their mind was something sexual? No. This is probably a pretty standard practice in Sodom, that if a foreigner came into town and they looked wealthy, they robbed them. And the kids probably got involved in it. But do you see how silly it is to keep ourselves locked in the one mindset about Sodom and about what they're doing wrong? Yeah, that's dumb, because then it makes the rest of the story kind of not make sense. Why are the kids coming out to have sex with grown men? They didn't do that in the ancient world. And they called to Lot and said, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." And this is the men talking. But Lot went out to them at the entrance, and he shut the door behind him. And he said, "No, my brothers, please do not do such a wrong thing. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you. Then do to them as it seems good in your eyes. O righteous Lot, only to these men do not do this thing, since they came under my roof for protection." Now, I've heard it tried to be explained in every possible way to not make this a really disgusting scene. And people are like, see, when you honor the messenger of the Lord by giving your daughter up to be raped, if you worship a God that needs that kind of honor, I'll tell him to piss off every time. And won't be afraid of him. Because that kind of God doesn't exist. That's ridiculous. If that's the justification that we're making in order to keep Sodom about sex, from a homosexual standpoint. How silly. But they said, step aside. Then they said, this fellow came to dwell as a foreigner, and he acts as a judge. Now we shall do worse to you than them. And they pressed very hard against the man, against Lot, and they drew near to break the door. The against Lot is thought of as an editorial hand. So there's a little explanation in there. So it's someone later on coming in and adding names into the story. That means that the story probably existed before there were names put in it. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's a lot of stories like this in the Bible where they add the characters' names to an existing story. And they change some details and make it about their, like Paul Bunyan. He dug the Grand Canyon. Well, not really, but we do have one. Then the men reached out with their hands and brought Lot into the house, and they shut the door. So again, there's a little explanation. Brought him in. Oh, wait, by the way, which men? Well, the ones that were in the house. Okay, we'll put that in there so they know that he get brought into the house. And the men who were at the entrance of the house, they struck with blindness, both small and great, and they were unable to find the entrance. Then the men said to Lot, who is here with you? Bring out from the place your sons-in-law and your sons and your daughters and all who are with you in the city. For we are about to destroy this place because their cry has become great before Yahweh. Yahweh sent us to destroy it. Then Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were taking his daughters and said, get up, go out from this place because Yahweh is going to destroy the city. But it seemed like a joke in the eyes of his sons-in-law. And as the dawn came up, the angels urged Lot, saying, get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are staying with you, lest you be destroyed with the punishment of the city. But when he lingered, the men seized him by his hand and his wife's hand and his 2 daughters by hand on account of the mercy of Yahweh upon him. In other words, their own free will to stay in destruction was violated by the overwhelming will of God to save them from destruction. But we have free will. That's neat. And they brought him out and set him outside of the city against his will. But you have to confess and repent and believe, and well, I don't know about all that. You'll notice there's actually not even repentance in this story. That tells you how old it is. It's not until a certain stage in Israel's theological evolution that repentance becomes something that cities can do. Nineveh repents, but the earlier cities like Noah doesn't give people a chance to repent. And Sodom and Gomorrah, they don't get a chance to repent. It's just like, hey, you're going to get destroyed. Can we do anything? Nope. Y'all screwed up big time. And you'll notice that it's not like idolatry. They aren't not keeping the fasts or the Sabbath. They aren't like not doing the feasts. They didn't eat leavened bread on the Passover. They mistreated immigrants and foreigners. And mistreated is a really, really kind way to say that. Oppressed, abused, imprisoned, raped, destroyed, stole from, however you want to describe it. Most likely killed most of the time. And after bringing them outside, one said, flee for your life, do not look behind you, and do not stand anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. And Lot said to them, no, please, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life, but I cannot flee to the mountains lest the disaster overtake me and I die. They just told him he'll be safe there. And he's like, no, I won't. Behold, this city is near enough to flee there, and it is a little one. In English, that makes no sense. Okay? This city is near enough to flee there, and it is a little one. Little one is Mizar. And they say it in just a second, and the name of the city is Zoar. So I don't know why the translators are doing it's a little one. Maybe Zoar was a little city at one point, but here you have that etiology come into play. They're trying to explain, oh, how did this city get here if the cities of the plain were destroyed? Oh, well, Lot asked for safety there. So that way Zoar is still here. And you see that in just another verse or so. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. So there's your explanation verse, of, well, how did this city survive this massive destruction that destroyed all these cities in the plain? Okay, now let's talk about the actual destruction for a second. Most scholars kind of agree that volcanic activity, not not probable in this area. Geologists say there's no stuff there that could produce falling fire and things like that. But there are other ancient sources that talk about the destruction of cities on the plain. And we also know that there's a massive fault line that goes under a lot of these areas. And in antiquity, when earthquakes would happen in areas where there is lots of tar and natural gas and oil, like there is in the Middle East, pretty much everywhere, when these earthquakes would happen, there was also usually storms. So there's lightning, and there's shaking the ground, and the lightning is igniting the tar, and there's fire, and there's smoke, and this happened. And there are other cultures that recorded this kind of stuff happening. And it's postulated because they have found a worship center south of this particular plain in the Middle East right now, in the Israel area, that there's no other explanation than that there were large cities around it at one point who have been totally wiped out. And the interesting thing is that there are no archaeological records of these cities. They aren't, normally when a city gets destroyed, they find layer data where walls have crumbled, right? Oh, so here's a compressed layer. There's nothing for these cities. So they were utterly, totally destroyed. And the area that they think there were is full of tar and oil. And so that makes sense, okay? So then we're going to go on down into the destruction of Sodom. And after the sun had risen upon the earth and Lot had entered Zoar, Yahweh rained down from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from Yahweh. Okay? I mean, this is serious stuff. And we all know that Zeus with a lightning bolt is like a common image for ancient deities, correct? So this shouldn't shock us. This shouldn't well, did God really do that? Again, wrong question. These aren't the questions to be asking. The questions to be asking are, how does God operate when they say that he does this? Because even in their missing it on the scientific data of why lightning happens and why thunder happens and why clouds roll over and high pressure systems and low, and how that all works, they are still saying something about the deity's involvement in all this. Okay, and again, this is like the flood story. This is a God who doesn't do this because he's just he's strolling the earth and he's well, I hate that culture. It's the last resort of someone who's actually kind of desperate, and so desperate that he's gone down himself to see what's going on. So the God of all creation takes a moment to appear as a human and go down and look at Sodom and see, is it really as bad as this outcry that's coming up to me? Okay, does that mean that this God knows everything? Yeah. So you can see how the view of God is changing as we are progressing now. God in the garden doesn't know where Adam is. Adam, where are you? This isn't a rhetorical question. This is a God who actually doesn't really know everything that's going on the earth. He just knows that what's going on is bad in this area. Okay, and so he's coming down to deal with it himself. So then when God, we can say biblically for the Hebrew writers, God's the ultimate cause because at some point God created everything. And so for them, it's not that God is actually doing this. It's that, he did set it all in motion. And so since he set it in motion and said that it was good, if something bad happens, it's because you were doing something wrong. Okay, and that's it's actually a more holistic theology than we have today. Because it just kind of assumes that life will go well for you if you are doing what Yahweh told you to do, whether you worship him or not. Sodom wasn't expected to worship Yahweh. They were expected to be hospitable to the stranger. It doesn't say, because Sodom isn't worshiping me in temples and with sacrifices. It says, because the outcry against them is so great. And he overthrew those cities and the whole plain. Again, this is why we have Zoar just above. And the whole plain. What about Zoar? Oh, well, we need to add that to the story, so let's go add that to the story real quick. And the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. And interestingly, this happens in Joshua too. So when we get kind of up in arms about the book of Joshua, note that inside the book of Joshua, it corrects the author. It's we wiped them out, obliterated them, they're gone. And these people who still dwell in the land to this day. And it's it's just correcting itself as it goes. So it's polemic correction, polemic correction. Okay, so that's how you don't get tripped up in Joshua. So Abraham arose early in the morning and went to the place where he had stood before Yahweh, and he looked down upon the surface of Sodom and Gomorrah, and upon the whole surface of the land, the plain, and he saw that, behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a smelting furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent out Lot from the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. And that's where we're going to cut it today, because the next little story actually has to do with some other people. It doesn't have to do with what we're talking about now. Okay, so a lot there, and we've kind of gone through some stuff on the way, but I want to keep saying in here. Yes. Here we are, we're only in Genesis 18, and we already have the second time that God has destroyed people. This is not looking good for us making our way through the whole Bible. This guy doesn't seem like a very good guy, or at least not worthy of worship. I wouldn't want to strum my guitar in front of that, because that's the kind of God that you hit a wrong chord and he wipes you out. Your chord has a pimple. No, but that's why it's important for us to learn to ask the right questions. You know, the premise of our questions is important. And so if I come to a story, and I like to harp on the flood because it's the most easily determined to be done in a very mythical way story in antiquity in our Bible. But that means when I come to the flood, it's the wrong premise to come and say, did God do this? That's not the right question to be asking. And so to answer that question, there's no way to answer it honestly. You weren't there. Even if you were there, you probably wouldn't have known if it was God that was doing it, or a cloud, or one of your deities, or, you know what I'm saying? That's the wrong question. That's like opening up Romeo and Juliet and saying, were these families really at war? Can I find historical proof that the Montagues and the Capulets were fighting each other and hated each other? No. Is it based on some stuff that yeah, there's probably a lot of truth in it. There are little pieces of history, and, you know, but that it's the wrong question. So when we come to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, the wrong question is, did God do this? The right question is, why does the story say that the cities were destroyed? Why does the story say that the flood happened? Because the earth was totally consumed by violence. It doesn't say because people were going about their day, living lives and worshiping Yahweh, and they were doing the Sabbath and remembering it and keeping it holy. And so God said, I hate them, and floods the earth. No. I mean, from the beginning, God protects the first murderer. He's like, I'm going to show you that the way out of this mess is not to keep killing. Yes. I'm going to protect the first murderer. So right away, your retributive justice goes out the door, which means the flood can't be retributive. Okay? And this is why it's important to know that Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4 are all part of the flood story. Because they give us the character of the deity in the story. And he does it as a last resort. And he does it to save everyone. Which means one of two things: that he knows that after they die, they're fine. That's kind of a morbid view, but it works. You know, or that through whatever is happening here, everything is going to be saved. And at either way, those are restorative ways. For the ancient world, a restorative deity is an oddity. One whose justice works are all restoration. Okay, so let's note or read then. This is also from Sarna. He said, it is to be noted that the salvation of Lot, unlike that of Noah, is not attributed to his righteousness. Notice it doesn't say that Lot was a righteous man. And Lot's behavior is abhorrent. He offers his daughters. That's not the behavior of a righteous man. The Bible underlines this fact by reporting that it was due to the Lord's mercy on him, and that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God was mindful of Abraham and removed Lot from the midst of the upheaval. That is to say, and here's where we're going to talk about merit in a different way, not because of his intrinsic merit was Lot saved, although he was certainly superior to his neighbors, but through the merit of Abraham. It is a curious fact that in this situation, we actually have a fulfillment in another form of the purport that the wrathful judgment of God could be averted through the merit of an innocent nucleus. And that's the story, right? This is God's judgment is coming, and Abraham inside himself knows, if I can just find some people there who are righteous, that'll be enough for the whole city. Okay? So God delivered Lot from the catastrophe through the merit of Abraham. This doctrine of merit is not an infrequent theme in the Bible and constitutes the first of many such incidents in which the righteousness of chosen individuals may sustain other individuals or even an entire group through its protective power. And I think you know where I'm headed with this, but we can give some Old Testament examples of like Moses staving off the wrath of God on Mount Sinai, right? Of Zipporah coming in when God's about to kill Moses and circumcising her son and saying no, and so for some reason the righteousness of the son staves off the wrath of God. And so it's this, and this is where we do get a lot of our like type and shadow type teaching. Okay, so Sarna goes on, he says, the Sodom and Gomorrah saga is accordingly the precursor of this biblical doctrine of merit, a doctrine that has profound consequences for man, for it implies that the individual is of supreme importance and that from his actions may flow beneficial consequences for all society. Okay, and this is a doctrine that is in the Hebrew Bible, and it is why Paul sees Jesus as the justification of all flesh. And the arguments that people get into over whether or not, is Jesus' death sufficient for everyone or just those that accept it, is because they don't know how to read the Bible. And they don't understand that this idea, it's like someone else can have been what was needed. And it affects everyone. Without their, like, Lot doesn't say, I'm Abraham's nephew. He never brings his family relation into the story. These guys, as far as Lot knows, they don't know that he's with Abraham. So he doesn't have to like, oh, the blood of Jesus is over me. He doesn't have the blood of Abraham. He's just Lot. He's just doing what he's supposed to do. He's not very righteous, but at least he's hospitable. But that lets you know what this story is about. This story is not about gay men. Okay? The story is about hospitality and how we're treating the one that's seeking asylum in our borders. And you can say don't get political, and I'm trying really, really hard not to. And I don't care about policy. What I care about is when there's an outcry arising from an oppressed people and the empire is defending their oppression. And I can do the debate, and I can like, let's sit down and let's talk through the talking points, and that's fine, and I won't hate you at the end of the day. But I will say that from a biblical perspective, the outcry of the oppressed will trump your political theory every day of the week. And God doesn't care about it, the political theory. From a biblical perspective, God intimately cares about the outcry of the oppressed. So much so that he personally visits it. And yeah, we can get like, now we have to have a theology class. Is God going to judge us like he did Sodom? Did God judge Sodom? There's the question you have to ask first. Historically, critically, probably not. Probably an earthquake. Nevertheless, the society is no longer around. And historically speaking, societies which are empires that become domination systems are not around for very much longer. And you can say, oh, God doesn't do that, and that's fine. I don't believe that God personally judges people either. But again, those societies are no longer around. Oppressive societies do not live long. And empires don't live long. Why? Because, at least from our perspective, he's brought low every principality and power. And he's revealed the utter inefficacy of them to do anything good. For every one little good thing that empire does, there's a mile of death behind it. And so we say, oh, but look at all the good they're doing. Yeah. We can keep looking at that one. Or we can say that, no, I'm sorry, Christian is my political statement. And that I don't get to say, so. We do understand that to be religious in the ancient world was to be political. And to be religious was to devote your political affiliation to a particular ruler. Caesar is Lord. Good news. This is what the Romans would say when they come into a land. They'd say, I've come with glad tidings of good news. It's going to be for all people. It's going to be for peace on earth, and your Lord is here. And this is what they said. They announced the gospel, is what they called it, of the arrival of the Lord, Caesar. Right. And the empire comes in, and the empire oppresses, and the empire oppresses, and the empire oppresses, and the king is born as an oppressed one. Okay? Please understand that the empire at this time, too, was also white, which really makes it uncomfortable. They were. Rome was white. Sorry. That's not comfortable. But they were, and they were in the Middle East, and they're oppressing people. But note that Jesus doesn't say, hey, please stop oppressing my people. He doesn't hold up a picket sign that says, down with Rome. No, what he does, it's even worse, because he goes around and he intentionally seeks out all the people that they're hurting and oppressing, and he heals them. And he's like, watch how inept you are. And he walks away. And he doesn't say, can you please play nicer now, Rome? Can you get out of my homeland? Can you stop crucifying my countrymen? Can you quit raping our women? Can you? No. And in fact, when one of the guards, one of the ICE agents of Jesus' day, comes to him and says, hey, can you come heal my servant? Jesus is like, yeah, no problem, let's go. And he's going to go heal him. Going to go to his house, going to go sit down with him and eat at his altar with him and heal this guy. And servant is ambiguous, and it can mean same-sex sex slave. It can mean house servant. We don't know, but Jesus goes anyways with the occupying force. And so this is what the Bible does. It's continually subverting what empire tries to do. It's all about oppression and domination and relief from that. And for those who know my journey over the last couple of years, I did not leave behind a specific kind of Christianity because I disagreed with their goals. I disagreed with their methods. But the goals are the same. Justice for all is actually not owned by the American Trademark Association. It's in the Bible. And God is a God of justice. And the problem is that today what we want on both, I'm just going to say both sides, but understand it's more like what's the satanic one, a pentagram? So it's probably 5 sides to the American political thing, is that no matter what, the Bible and Jesus and how this is all put together is going to subvert something in each little group's ideology. And there always comes this moment where it's like, okay, what gets to win here? Does my political ideology get to win? Or does something that I say I worship religiously get to win? Do I like Naaman? He's a Syrian, and they're at war with Israel, and he goes to get healed by an Israelite. And the Israelite heals him. It's Elijah. So they're at war, and he heals his enemy. That's not, this is not normal behavior. And this is how the Bible continually upsets the idea that empire is in the right. And here, it's like, even in an ancient, known to be very, very old, theologically not very evolved story of the destruction of Sodom, you have the same theme being brought out that is still being brought out today. They're oppressing people, and hence they are going to go away. And it's uncomfortable. And I know with where we are right now in America, it's uncomfortable. And I know that people are arguing about this every day in every possible way that they can. And I don't really care about all the arguments. You know, I don't really care about the theological aspects of it. What I care about is that if we say that we believe any kind of systematic way about what this book is saying from beginning to end, that we don't get to ignore asylum seekers, period, ever, sadly. But my party says, the guy you said was your God said. And again, what's the method for that? I don't know. But I know that like Sarna said, cynical disregard of the suffering of the outcast isn't something that God seems to look too lightly on in the Bible. Theologically, look, we can say things like, if God was going to judge us, he would have. And I agree with that. If God didn't wipe America off the face of the map for slavery, or Germany for the Holocaust, or Israel for what they've done to Palestine, or any of the other things that people have done, then he's not gonna. But what we can say is that it is evidenced for thousands of years that it is something that he takes very seriously. So that his authors continually write stories about this. And they're like, you know, and Ezekiel is really probably in history a couple thousand years after Sodom and Gomorrah. And Ezekiel says prophetically, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, what's it all about? Does he say that it's because of their sexual sin? No, he says it's because they refused to care for the widow and the orphan. And it says they were fat and overfed and they had grown lazy. And they didn't show hospitality to the outcast. I mean, this is Ezekiel. And then the guy goes on and he really ticks off the evangelicals and he says, but wait, God will restore the fortunes of Sodom. So even if you believe that God destroyed Sodom for the reason that he didn't destroy it for, you got to reconcile the fact that he says, oh, but their fortunes are going to be restored. So there's really kind of nowhere you can go to make this claim. And I've got 10 minutes. And so what we're going to do for the last 10 minutes is we're going to give a brief overview of my 15-page essay on the Bible and homosexuality. Because now's the time to do it, right? We're in Sodom. We're like walking through the Bible and we've arrived at Sodom. And now what do? I don't believe that there's anybody in this room that has any particular issue, but I'm going to deal with things linguistically so that you see that the issue that you have isn't based in good translation. Okay, and that shouldn't be a problem for most of us to say, hey, when things come from a dead language into English, some things are going to get missed, partly because there are words that appear in the Bible that there is no other reference to that word anywhere else, anywhere. And so when you have a word that only appears one time in the Bible, you're kind of forced to say, well, what does this mean? Does it mean what I think it means just because of some translation? Or do they have a reason for this? And so this is why textual criticism matters. Sometimes what they have is they have, like I have this set called Ancient Near Eastern Texts Relating to the Old Testament. Okay, and it's thousands of documents that they found in other languages, and some of them are in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and some of them are in Canaanite languages and just different languages and all this stuff. Well, they use some of the words that Israel adopts into their language that only appear one time, right? So sometimes we can get from these other languages, oh, well, that's probably what this word meant. But the problem is that doesn't always work because like in French, there's a word that doesn't mean to assist that sounds like assist. Okay, so just because a word sounds the same between two languages also doesn't mean that that's what it means. Okay, you seen how confusing this gets real quickly? Okay, well, I'm gonna jump forward first, and we're gonna deal with this New Testament thing because this is the one that most of us care about. Oh yeah, we're not under Leviticus anyways, but we'll deal with Leviticus too. Paul in the New Testament makes up a word, and the word is arsenokoite, and that word, about 70 years ago, first got translated homosexuality. That's not what that word means. Nobody knows what that word means because Paul made it up. Okay, it didn't exist before Paul, and after him it got used in different ways. So there was no, this is what that word means. Okay? So when you take a word that someone has fabricated in a language that is not their first language, because Paul's Aramaic speaking, right? So Greek isn't even his first language, and he made the word up in Greek, and then you take that word and you start putting it into other languages, what right do you have to assert any kind of like surety that this is what he meant? Any? None. I'll clear it up. None. If I go to Spanish and I just make up some word that sounds Spanish, I don't get to then translate that into Russian and say, now in Russian, this means this. I mean, do you see the logical disconnect there? It doesn't work. But for some reason, we've been taught, well, because it appears in English, it's inerrant. Bull crap. And I'm going to show you why. Because arsenokoitos doesn't mean anything. The two words together mean man and lie. Like lay down. So any man who lays down? I mean, if we're going to play the etymology game, well, what are the sum of its parts? Man who lies down? Oops. That means nobody who's ever taken a nap is inheriting the kingdom. No, that's not what it means. However, if you look at where Paul puts this word, context can teach us something. And again, it's the run example. I got to run to the store because my dog has the runs and my nose is running and my refrigerator stopped running. Those don't all mean the same thing. I can't just go to a dictionary and look up every possible definition for the word run and play the Amplified Bible game and like stick it in every time the word run appears. The sentence would make no sense whatsoever. It would be dumb. Total nonsense. But we do this with our Bible all the time because it's Greek. And they didn't mean anything. So we can just pick whatever we want from the available possible definitions of a word. I used to do here when I preached a lot. That was bad. I shouldn't have done that. I was wrong. Don't listen to my old teachings where I talk about Greek. But when someone puts something in a specific context, then we can start looking at what maybe the meaning is. I got to run to the store. Okay, so obviously he's probably not going to do this. But how do you know? Well, because he has to pick up more than one thing. Oh, well, there's context. Okay, thanks. So when Paul uses this word, it appears twice. Okay, and when Paul uses this word, the first time he sandwiches it, and actually both times he does this, it's really clear the first time. There's all these acts of economic exploitation, right? Don't steal, don't cheat one another, and it's all economic. And then don't be an arsenokoites, and then don't do things like sexual domination and things like this. So it's between economic exploitation, sexual exploitation. I wonder what he could be talking about. Well, there's a scholarly lexicon called Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich that when you look up the word arsenokoites, it says pederasty. You know what that is? That's where you buy a child from a family for the purposes of having sex with them. It's an act of economic and sexual exploitation. Oh my goodness, that fits so perfectly where Paul is saying, don't do this stuff. And guess what? It's also known in the ancient world. And it usually was a male teacher and a young boy. So the reason it's kind of this masculine overtone is that that's usually how it worked. But it's also not unheard of for an older woman to buy a younger man for the purposes of pleasing her. And this happened, and it probably still happens in some parts of the world. And not that's not funny, but I just mean human sexuality it's not the same across the spectrum. Like in different cultures, different things are allowed. And like if we don't understand that, travel. Okay, and there's no one okay, like not every culture has straight gay. They have multiple manifestations of sexuality. They have multiple rules. In a lot of cultures, 14 is a perfectly fine age to get married to an older man. Mary was 14 when she had Jesus. Okay, so some things are just there. Well, this is going on in the ancient world, and Paul says, hey, don't be deceived. Pederasts won't inherit the kingdom. Okay. I mean, I don't know how I feel about all that in my view of inclusion and how God looks beyond the brokenness of life. But at the same time, I can see why he's saying what he's saying. Now, to further kind of gum up that issue is the fact that there was a word that meant penetrated man in a sexual sense, and Paul does not use that word. Well, that's an argument from silence. Yeah, but he was silent on purpose. He could have used that word. He knew that word, and he didn't. He used a different word and sandwiched it in between acts of exploitation. Wow. All of a sudden, it kind of makes sense why certain churches like to translate that word homosexual instead of pederast. Because they've been protecting their pederasts for thousands of years. Oh, well, what about Romans? Well, what about Romans? How about when Paul says, for the wrath of God is revealed? He's quoting his opponent. And he's being sarcastic. And if you don't believe me, you'll have to read Daniel's paper on Gar, which is a Greek for. When Paul uses that word, he is setting off his opponent's teaching. And inside his opponent's teaching is where he talks about, oh, even the women were consumed with passions for one another that weren't in all this. And Paul calls that a false gospel. In like 2 chapters, he's like, that's all false. But we don't read Romans as Romans. We read Romans as, well, what Romans 1:26 says. Well, you're not reading the whole thing, and you're not reading Greek rhetoric. Because in Greek rhetoric, what he's doing is very clear. And he's saying, here's my opponent's teaching, now watch me knock it down. And the way he knocks it down is, everybody gets grafted into Israel, and so all Israel shall be saved. So he basically says, because of the one act, the merit went to all, and all are saved. So that's kind of it in the New Testament, right? Jesus is totally silent on the matter. Well, that's because it was well known. So was caring for the poor. We kind of just read about that. That's one of their earliest stories. And Jesus talks about caring for the poor all the time, but yet he never says a word about sexuality, other than dominative acts, like don't dominate. Philip is Greek, and the Greeks are known for their open sexuality. And never once does he turn to Philip and go, hey, what your people do is not okay. And then the Old Testament, we just covered Sodom and Gomorrah. Did anybody read ahead of me and pick out the place where it's like, oh, and by the way, it's also because they were gay? No, that's not in there at all. And so we know that. And then Leviticus has 2 verses, and the Leviticus verses just don't say what you think they say. Again, context is king. And when you have a long list of laws that say don't diddle your family members, but all of those family members are women, and the very last law in the list of laws is also not the males, is that talking about any male consensual act of sex? Or is it talking about the same kind it was just talking about? Do you think that they all of a sudden change topics? Nobody does that. You don't write 25 laws about incest and then say, oh, and by the way, consensual sex between these two is wrong. No, it's still about incest. Hey, all the females that we just said, that applies to the males too. And also, don't offer your children to Molech in the fire. That's in the other one. These are family laws. They are not societal consent laws. Okay, this Leviticus is not saying you can't ever love someone of the same sex. And totally gone from the discussion is women. Never once does the Bible say anything about lesbians, ever. So at a very minimum, homosexuality just doesn't work, because that's a word that encompasses both male and female. No, so the only thing we can say is that according to Leviticus, I shouldn't have sex with my male family members. I'm never going to violate that law. Even because Jesus, I'm not going to violate that law. That's not a big deal for me. It shouldn't be a big deal for any of us. I'm also not going to violate the one to not have sex with female family members. And that's it, folks. There are 6 verses out of 32,000 verses in the Bible. That's just the Protestant canon. If you go up to the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, they've got the most 60 or 76 or something like that books. They're upwards of like 50,000 verses, and there are still only 6 verses. And in those 6 verses, 3 of them use the word arsenokoites. And we feel like we have the right to translate that word with surety: homosexuality. How stupid. There's a guy named Dale B. Martin who is a New Testament professor at Yale, and he's a gay man, and he's written a ton of good essays on this. And he says, we don't know what this word means. He has every reason to say this word doesn't mean this or that. And all he says is we don't know what it means because it's a new word. It was made up and it wasn't used again. It's not like it didn't pervade the language all of a sudden about these until Paul used it. Now there's another word, and then we'll wrap this up because, and that one's malakos. And malakos is kind of a silly word to get caught up on because it means effeminate. And really all you have to do with that is say first century guys didn't like effeminate men. Because there's just nothing. There's no ground to stand on, biblically speaking, that it's wrong to be effeminate. And what does that mean anyways? Well, no, I mean, like I showered this morning and I smell okay. That's malakos. I don't inherit the kingdom, according to Paul. I also, for breakfast I had McDonald's, which I shouldn't have. But it had sausage and egg, and it had cheese, and I put my hash browns on it. If you haven't done that, that's like the best way to eat McDonald's. But that's decadent food, right? So that's malakos. McDonald's might keep you from inheriting the kingdom. I took my kids one time, well, a couple of the older kids, to see the Nutcracker for Christmas. And when the dancers go across the stage and they're like smooth and their dress goes, that's malakos. So, I mean, do we see kind of the ambiguity in grabbing words and saying, oh, these people are condemned because of some word that Paul used? Like, it never means everything the word means. In no sentence ever uttered does any word always mean everything the word could possibly mean. We would never, ever, 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 ever talk about anything if we had to do that. We don't talk, discuss, lecture, like amplified discussion would go nowhere. And so would let's just switch some words around here. No, I'm just kidding. But for some reason, when it comes down to a very infinitesimally small portion of the human population who happens to be wired or makes the choice, either way, don't care, of experiencing their sexuality with either same sex or not at all, or like for some reason we act like we have the right to assert that an ancient word means something that we have no idea what it meant. And like I said, when we have another word that does mean that and it didn't get used, that's a pretty good indication that that's probably not what he meant. Which means contextually I have to say, what's he talking about? Oh, domination and exploitation. And the Bible is from start to finish against domination and exploitation. And it applies to sexuality just like it applies to immigration, just like it applies to how we treat one another in our homes. Husbands, don't dominate or exploit your wives. Love them as Christ loved the church. Okay, that's a way to say that. Okay, we can be done now.